Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior AP English, and our objective today now is to introduce to you the life of England's maybe greatest poet. I mean, this always becomes a debate, right? You put Shakespeare, T.S. Eliot would certainly put Shakespeare in the, in the discussion of the running for the greatest English poet. But if it's not Shakespeare, it probably almost always is considered John Milton. Let's talk about Milton, first of all, in regards to biography. I'm on page 480, 481 of your hymnal. And then once we kind of get through a few pieces of information, we'll be ready to move on then to talk a little bit about two of his sonnets. I'll try to use his biographic background information to help us understand and read two of his sonnets. And then finally, the greatest of his works, the greatest of his works, Paradise Lost. And we'll have to maybe begin the process of trying to unpack what really is a pretty esoteric and difficult poem, at least at times. Let's begin, first of all, by talking about who this cat is, John Milton. First of all, we should point out that John Milton is, during his day, already understood to be pretty much the smartest guy alive. Okay? I mean, he like Francis Bacon, a name that we'll work with later, like Francis Bacon, he is a prodigy at an extremely young age. What makes Milton intriguing is that he was predominantly, he was formally educated, but he was predominantly self-taught through his reading. Are you ready for this? For about 6 years, Milton hangs out with his father on their estate. His father was a fairly wealthy man who had purchased most of the known books of their generation, of their time. In that library, Milton sat for 6 years, and are you ready for this? He read all those volumes. Okay? From sunup to sundown, and then long after sundown, Milton had that kind of mental ability to work for hours and hours at a time reading. But wait, I'm not finished. Are you ready for this? He read in the original languages. Okay? Milton was an amazing linguist. So when he picked up a German author, he would read in German. He would pick up a French author, read in French, etc., etc. He read the Bible in the original languages of Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. He was a scholar in all three and knew them well. And I'm not done yet. Milton had this really frightening ability to remember what he read. I mean, some of us will admit that if we were to really look at what we've read since we were freshmen, we would say it's probably a page or two. But the reality is, most of what we've read, we would have to admit, we remember in the abstract. That is to say, yeah, I read The Giver, but I kind of can tell you its highlights. I can't tell you everything that happened in that novel. Or, yeah, I read some of Plato's Republic Part 1, but it's not like I can tell you all of the intimate details. I mean, I actually read it, but you know how we do this where you forget stuff? Milton could remember what he read. They would play games with him, for example, where they would read him a quote from the Bible. He would begin quoting from that verse forwards and backwards, word for word. Now, this is not unusual. Truman Capote, the great writer, he had a similar kind of ability, and once was in fact tested by an interviewer who handed him the brand new copy of the New York Times front page. Truman Capote read it for 3 or 4 minutes, handed it back, and then started reciting word for word everything he had just read. This is what some will call photographic memory. Let's just say what it is. Milton has the capacity to remember the things that he reads. He can remember them, he will report in some of his journal writing. He can remember them in regards as well to where they sit on the page. Now, some of you can remember this, especially if you annotate stuff. You can remember, oh yeah, I made a note about this, and it was kind of on the right-hand side. It was in that first paragraph. Milton kind of had a similar type of ability, but then he also would remember word for word the stuff he read, much of it. And the other thing that makes him so important is he was a great synthetic thinker, as many of the greatest minds of the Renaissance were. What do I mean by synthetic thinker? Well, he can read in multiple disciplines, and then he's always finding contiguities, relationships. All right? So, for example, he can be reading early Mesopotamian fables and myths, and he will draw from that as well from his study, for example, of passages from the book of Exodus. Do you got me? In the Bible. And he'll put them together. To that degree, we often will reference Milton as the great Renaissance man because of his training and his reading background. Okay? But we're only getting started. Milton wasn't just a great reader, he aspired to be a great writer. More than anything else, Milton wanted to write what would be read long after his life ended. Now, Milton is a contemporary. You can see your dates there, on 480. Milton is a contemporary, near contemporary of Shakespeare, right? Think about it. Shakespeare's Hamlet is produced on stage 1600. Roughly a decade later, a little less than a decade later, Milton himself is born. So Milton knows the plays of Shakespeare. He knows the life of Shakespeare, the plays of Shakespeare. What Milton wants is he wants to be remembered, are you ready for this? The way Homer is remembered. Okay, that's how Milton wants to be remembered. He wants to write something that can put him on the literary map for all time. All right? So as he's a young man, educated, being self-taught, I mean, think about how this is different from the way most students go to school, right? So you go to college, you take an English class, you read a few poems, you got to read a novel. Will this be on the test? Do I have an exam over this? What's my grade in the class? That's the way most normal students think about a class. Milton takes a class, like for example where he reads Homer's Iliad, and he says, I want to write something as good or better than the Iliad before I die. Not, are you ready for this? I want to, but I will. That's the difference for Milton. Not that he has aspirations, he will do it. As in, I will do this before I die. As in, every morning you wake up, some of you will call this fanaticism, some of you will just call this crazy. You would wake up every morning and say, I got to write something better than the Iliad. I've got to write something better than the Iliad. I've got to write something better than the Iliad. Oh yeah, don't forget, he's got the Iliad memorized in Greek. In Greek. But his ambitions are to do something greater than what Homer has done. Right? And he, to some degree, puts a lot of pressure on himself. Then he starts going blind. See, our story is actually only starting. The real story is about to begin. He starts going blind, which would mean, I suppose, something to everyone. It's a pretty traumatic experience. But when your whole life is given to reading and writing, to start going blind is a major deal. Part of the reason is just the degeneracy of the eyes by virtue of all the reading that he was doing by candlelight. I mean, think about this. He's reading when there's no electric lights. Think about the way in 1650 that as the sun goes down, everybody's life basically adapts to that. I mean, you can put a candle or light a fire in a fireplace, but that is not the same thing as having really good lighting to read by. Milton would read thousands and thousands of pages by candlelight, where he would hold the candle right next to his face and have the book right in front of him late into the night as he's reading. His eyes begin to deteriorate, and then he goes blind. Now this degeneration begins to happen, and then it becomes fairly noticeable, and then he just loses his sight. And he still hasn't written what he considers to be anything of merit. Now, by other people's standards, what he's already written is quite remarkable. But by his own standards, not good enough. Why? Because he's measuring whatever it is he's going to do against Homer, against Virgil. So when you start looking at that as your kind of comparative analysis, I mean, a baseline, obviously he feels himself lesser. It's at that point when he's blind that he writes Paradise Lost. He writes it by reciting it. Now, for those of you that know anything about the great composer Mozart, you kind of are already introduced to this idea that Mozart composed and wrote his music without erasure marks. We have first-hand copies of Mozart's symphonies where he writes full pages and there are no erasure marks. Every note he puts on the page is the note, and there's no erasure marks. Now, this isn't because he made mistakes somewhere else and then recopied. We have originals of his stuff that shows he was writing the music as he heard it in his head. Symphonically, he heard it in his head. He could hear the entire piece of music symphonically. That is to say, all the different instruments playing simultaneously. And then he could pull out a strand, for example, of the violins, and he could write that, okay, as if he was hearing everything else. Of course, you don't make that. You're born with that talent, right? Milton recites Paradise Lost to his amanuensis daughters who are writing this stuff down. It will blow the minds of scholars later, the nuances of Milton's genius. When sin and death is introduced for the first time in Paradise Lost, it is exactly at line 666. No kidding. Now, that can be maybe construed if you're a writer with sight, and you're like looking and going, oh yeah, I'm approaching line 666, a very important number, of course, in numerology theory. And when I introduce sin, I'm going to do it at line 666, and you can kind of see. But if you're reciting this poetry out loud and people are writing it down, how can you know when you're at line 666? Do you see my point? So in other words, Milton is going to play multiple games in Paradise Lost. But before we get to Paradise Lost, I want to first of all spend a little time with two famous sonnets of his. So I'm now with you on page 482. Given the little bit of background that I've just given to you, and obviously there's a lot more that you should be familiar with over time, right? We'll want to now pay attention to these two sonnets. Start with me on 482 real quickly. How soon hath time, and then when I consider how my light is spent. Both of these sonnets, and since we are now creators of sonnets, and one of the reasons why I make you actually sit and try and write your own sonnet is just to get a sense of the degree of difficulty to just try and get that stupid rhyme scheme and that ba-bum, 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 ba-bum thing going, right? Then, when you go back and look at a real genius writing the sonnet, you'll get some sense of just how incredible it is that he's able to say what he's want to say within the confines of 14 lines of iambic pentameter with rhyme scheme. Let's first look at how soon hath time. I'm on 482. How soon hath time, the subtle thief of youth, stolen on his wing my 23 year. How old is he? 23. He's 23 years old when he writes this sonnet. My hastening days fly on with full career, but my late spring no bud or blossom showeth. Put it in your own words. What's he saying in the first 4 lines? I'm 23 years old and what? I'm a complete loser. I've done nothing. Of course, one or two of us would point out, dude, at 23? Really? 20? You already want to have done something really great by 23? And the fact that you haven't, now he's going to beat himself up for the rest of the sonnet. He's going to beat himself up about the fact that I'm a complete loser. I haven't done anything by the age of 23. I point this sonnet out to you just to give you a sense of the degree of pressure, stress he put on himself. Now, granted, some of this was adopted by his father and others who had taught him, who recognized at a very young age just how brilliant he was. And this often is the case. Some will say brilliance is often more a curse than it is a blessing because of the pressure one has on oneself. Take a look at what he says. But my late spring no bud or blossom showeth. Perhaps my semblance might deceive the truth, that I to manhood am arrived so near, and inward ripeness doth much less appear, that some more timely happy spirits endureth. I'm never going to be happy because I can't produce anything of value. Yet be it less or more or soon or late, it shall be still in strictest measure even to that same lot, however mean or high, towards with time, notice it's capitalized, leads me, and the will of heaven, notice heaven capitalized. All is, if I have grace to use it so, as ever in my great taskmaster's eye. Now, I didn't mention this, but I'll mention it now. Along with all the other stuff I said about Milton, he is a devout Christian, a devout believer. So there's kind of two sides to that. One, He recognizes early on he has talent, tremendous talent, dare we say it, prodigious talent. Arguably one of the brightest cats to ever live, along with Goethe and, Bacon, Francis Bacon, a few other guys like that. And yet at the same time, along with this talent, Milton feels great responsibility to do something with this talent. In other words, God gave me this talent. If I don't do something with it, I will be damned by God. So from a very young age, easily by 8, 9, 10, he had already internalized this view. I must do something great with my talent or I have let God down. At the age of 23, he still feels like he's a complete and total failure. It's like it hasn't happened. Now, we are familiar with this in the world of, like, for example, sports. When we see a young prodigy, we think of LeBron James, don't we? Who by the time he's 18 years old, physically looks stronger and bigger than most men in the NBA. And he's only 18, 19 years old. And he arrives in the NBA, and immediately the expectations are for LeBron James that he will perform beyond expectations. Already at the age of 19, people were writing in Sports Illustrated and elsewhere, this will be the greatest player of all time in basketball. At 19, imagine the pressure of knowing that. So, for example, in his first season, he doesn't win a championship. Now people are all saying, oh, great, he's a complete loser. You could read people who are actually saying this before the age of 21. People were already labeling him as wasted talent. He could have been great. So we're kind of familiar with this concept, but here's Milton at the age of 23. He's putting it on himself, saying, I'm a complete and total loser because I haven't done anything. How does the sonnet end, though? What do you make of those last two couplets? And by the way, I love this sonnet because it proves you don't have to write a sonnet about love. This sonnet obviously has absolutely nothing to do with romantic love. This is a sonnet in which Milton himself says what at the end of the sonnet? Do you get any sense of it? Batson, what's he saying at the end of the sonnet?
If he is the time.
Time. I just hope I don't die. I can't die. I can't die. I can't die. And this will become one of those kinds of things. Any young person with talent will recognize this potentially as a serious issue. How much time do I have? Do I have like 10 years? Do I have like 20 years? And will my talent stay with my getting older, right? Of course, physical athletes are completely aware of this. They only have a very small window of time to work with the exception of some really rare exceptions who can move on into their older age and continue to perform at optimum levels. As you age, physically you drop off. Milton is concerned as well because during this time period in Europe, lots of disease. People will wake up dead all the time. They'll get sick and be dead in a matter of days or weeks. And so Milton is aware that he's got all his talent, but he hasn't produced anything at 23. I hope I have enough time. The idea that the poem ends then is, if God will just give me enough time, I hope I can produce something of merit. Then, with all that pressure on him, he starts losing his sight. I mean, you can just imagine. This would be like, for example, a brilliant vocalist who all of a sudden starts losing her voice and realizing that, oh no. I should point out, this for Milton has nothing to do with making bank. It's not like, oh no, I'm not going to be able to write and therefore become a millionaire. He never had to worry about currency in his life. So all he had to do was just read and write. But for him, it was about fame with a capital F. Maybe we would say capital letters A-M-E as well. He wanted to be known for the rest of the history of the world. And that's a lot of stress. And then he starts going blind. And then he writes this next sonnet right before he goes blind. This is one of his last sonnets. Let's take a look at this one on page 483. When I consider how my light is spent. That makes sense now, huh? What's that mean? Yeah, he can't see. The light of his eye is starting to go out, right? When I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide, lodged with me, useless. Woo. So he recognizes, I know I've got talent, but what am I doing with my talent? I should point out by this point, when he's writing the sonnet, he's already written 4 or 5 poems that are knocked down some of the best poems written in the English language already. But it's not good enough. It's not good enough. He's one of those kind of guys. Have you ever been around one of these kind of people? It's just not good enough. They write a 98% on the exam in calculus, and they want to know with Mr. Krugner why they missed something. You know, and you go, really? Seriously? But for them, it isn't about the grade. It's about learning the material, mastering, dare we say it, the material. For those of us who don't have this inclination, we kind of look at these types of people and go, really? I mean, come on, give the rest of us a break. But for Milton, this is it. He says, everything I've done, useless. Right? And you kind of look at what he's done to this point, and it's like, you know, dude, you already kind of stand in a pretty good group of people. Not good enough, he says. Keep reading. Though my soul more bent to serve there with my Maker, notice Maker capitalized, and present my true account, lest he returning chide, doth God exact day labor light denied? Now, in the book of Matthew, there's the Bible, there's a famous story that Christ tells about a rich man who has 3 sons, and he leaves each one of the sons a small amount of money. And he says, take care of this money, and then he leaves, and he's gone for a while. And the first of the oldest of the sons goes out and invests his money and makes more money. And the second does the same. The third son is the youngest, and he's worried about losing his money, so he goes and he hides it under the ground. The master comes back. This again is a parable, we call a parable story. Master comes back, and he's very pleased with his first 2 sons. Yay, nice job. You took 10 grand and made it into 2 million type of thing. Way to go. And then he bestows on them even more money, right? Even more. So, but the third one, he asks, okay, what'd you do with your money? And he says, well, I was worried. I was worried I was going to lose it. And so I buried it in the ground, but I have it still. See, I didn't lose it. To which we are told that this master father looks down with tremendous scorn on this. How dare you waste your talent? Now, the word talent, actually in translation, is the word money. Our word talent, of course, becomes that which is a gift endowed by one, for Milton, by his God. He imagines standing before the deity and saying, I know I've got talent, but I couldn't do anything with it because I was blind. And the deity saying back to him, what? Just because you lose your sight? Does that let you off the hook? I don't think so. You can kind of get a sense of Milton's view of God and Milton's view of deity. That is to say, I gave you talent, I expected something in return, and you're telling me now you're losing your sight? You get off the hook. I don't think so. Let's point out, Milton's writing this sonnet for himself. Isn't this weird? So he's writing to himself in the last gleams of light of his eyes. This is one of the last things he writes to himself. Doth God exact day labor light denied, I finally ask, but patience, notice the capital P, to prevent that murmur soon replies. Now patience is going to speak back to Milton, who's really worried about wasting his talent. God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state is kingly. Thousands is his bidding speed, and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. Put it in your own words. What is it that Milton imagines patience saying to him? What is patience? Right, what are those final lines from Longfellow's Psalm of Life? Learn to labor and to wait, right? Those final lines. Longfellow, very influenced by Milton. Let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. Milton's life story will become, in many ways, the story for artists to come. That is to say, you've got talent, and you haven't produced anything, but you aspire to produce something, and then finally you do produce something, and it's of great considerate value. Well, Milton goes blind, and then he picks up Paradise Lost as an idea. Now, what is Paradise Lost? And let's talk it through. We're just introducing it now. Okay, obviously we'll have more to say about it. Milton is familiar with the famous story. I'm going to use the word myth, but I need you to understand, when I use this word myth, I don't mean it as a story that's untrue. We will define in academic language a myth as a story that explains the unexplainable. Milton is very interested in the myth of Genesis 3. Now, what is that myth? Well, if you know anything about the Bible, and you'll remember that I put this on your reading list for a reason, in many ways you've been moving your whole career as an academic to come to this reading. This is the culmination point in many ways of your entire reading career. That is to say, you're never going to pick up anything that's more unbelievably complex than this poem, right? And just a little bit of background that I've given to you gives you some reason to go, whoa, so finally he creates something at the end of all of this. What he does is he picks up a story that's told in Genesis 3. Now, I've given you a handout of this because I don't assume that you've got this intel necessarily at home. What we're working with is a copy of what we call the King James Version of the Bible from 1611. Look at your dates and you'll get a sense, right, of his time and then this, okay? Genesis 3 tells an important story. Adam and Eve are the first man and woman in this cosmogonic myth. And they are placed inside of a famous garden, which is referenced as Eden. Within that garden, they are placed and are given some rules. Very simple rules. It appears that the very first, in this myth at least, man and woman are vegetarians. They eat from trees. But they are told about a single tree they're not allowed to eat from. Now, what you want to do before our conversation of tomorrow is you want to have read this little passage from the 1611 King James Version of the Bible. There's two things about this passage I want to point out for you, and you obviously will write it down here. Now, one is what it does say. The entire story, what it does say. But I'm more interested in what it does not say. What is not in this story that you have probably always assumed was a part of the story. Okay? What's not there? And that's kind of where we'll begin. What Milton does, are you ready for this? He takes this and then builds all of Paradise Lost from these few verses from this one story. Come back tomorrow. We'll also do a little quiz over book 2, and we'll be ready to continue with Milton's Paradise Lost.